Okay, so in today's lesson, we'll be looking at how to answer questions well, so crafting the perfect answer, which is basically a very important part of doing science or doing any kind of examination, because being able to answer the question well would actually result in you getting the mark. Alright, so without further ado, let's move on. So just a disclaimer to the viewers who are watching this. This presentation or this lesson is not a magic pill. So what this means is that you need to keep on practicing the skills that are taught in this video, because simply knowing the skills is not enough, because you have to be able to use it in different two different questions. Alright, so the structure of this presentation will be as such. Firstly, we will look at what you already know. Secondly, question types, the different type of question types, and what kind of how you can answer the different question types. Step 3, we'll be looking at how to organize our answers so that they follow a step-by-step structure, which provides clarity to your answer. So, and lastly, we'll be looking at the conclusion, which puts what you have learned in parts 1, 2, 3 together. Alright, so before we begin about learning how to answer questions, we need to ask ourselves, what are questions? So basically, questions are a request for information, and the information that you give to the asker is known as the answer. So when you give good answers to questions, a person does not have to ask any further questions because you have provided the necessary information. So bad answers, on the other hand, do not provide enough information that is required by the person asking the questions. So they have to keep on asking you questions in order to get the right amount of information that they require. Alright, so now let's take a look at some samples of questions. So basically, look at the question below. What do you eat for lunch? And if you answer, I was extremely hungry, it would lead to a further question. What did you eat for lunch? So you do not give the right amount of information or the right information which is required by the question. So good answers do not lead to further questions. And the example is seen here. So what do you eat for lunch? I ate a plate of chicken rice for lunch. After you provide this answer, the person who is asking the question does not have to ask any further questions, because the answer that you give is just right. Alright, so looking at section 1 of the presentation, we have already learned from the previous video the TKR square method. And just to recap what you already know, T is topic, K is keywords, R is relationships, and the second R is relevance. So if you are not sure about what TKR square is, do refer to the TKR square video. Alright, so when we look at the last R of TKR square, which is relevance, a question then comes to mind. How do I know what is relevant? Because from TKR, we generate a lot of information. However, we do not know which part of this information is relevant to the question. And the way that you know what is relevant to the question is by looking at the question type. Alright, so when you're doing your paper, remember this. Different questions need different answers. And a good way to imagine this is to imagine the example of firefighters. So all fires are not the same, and firefighters use different methods to put out different types of fires. So for example, you have a fire that is caused by fossil fuels, a fire that is caused by electricity. When you're dealing with an electrical fire, you would definitely not use water, because water is a good conductor of electricity, and it might make the fire actually spread. It might actually result in the source of the fire spreading. So you might actually use things such like a gas or carbon dioxide fire extinguisher in order to put out an electrical fire. This is the same for science questions. When you're dealing with different questions, you need to give different answers. So you do not have a one-size-fits-all answer, which is why practice is very important. So you know these different kind of questions and different kind of answers that they require. All right, so let's take a look at the different question types. You can find the table on the right in your orange book, page 309 to 310. So I will not be reading everything from this page because you can do that yourself, but I'll be basically giving you a general idea of how to use this table. So if we look at the leftmost column, we have some keywords there. So these keywords are actually in the questions which you see in your paper. Compare, classify, describe, explain. So these keywords should actually give you a clue about what the question requires and what is relevant to the question. And in the middle column of the table, they give you an instruction of what you should do. So basically, when you read this question, what should you do? What kind of information should you provide? So this is the first step to the last R of TKR square, finding what is relevant. So after you have done your T, your K, your R, and then you want to do your last R, look out for the question types through the keywords in the question. All right. So this is a continuation of the question types, which can be found on page 309 to 310. This one is on page 310. So for example, if the question is asking you to predict, briefly state what you think will happen. So that particular event has not happened yet, but you are, based on your scientific knowledge, you have to generate a possible situation that can happen. So for example, I leave a cup of water out in the open. Predict what will happen to the glass of water based on my knowledge on heat, based on my knowledge about the processes related to water. When it is exposed to heat, I can say that the amount of water in the glass would decrease because of evaporation. So you see how you have generate a huge amount of information in your TKR, but only a small amount of it is relevant, and you are able to identify what is relevant through your final R, which is relevance. And based on looking at the keywords, you can identify what is it that I must take from this huge amount of information that I have generated. All right, so moving on. So what you should do is, in your final R, which is relevance, look at the keywords when identifying relevance. All right, so let's take a look at some examples as a form of practice. So let's take a look at this. The diagram below shows a wet towel hung up to dry. Describe and explain two changes that would happen to the water in the wet towel. So let's do our TKR square. What topic is it? Heat and forces, because something is being hung. So remember that it might be forces, not only heat. So in our keywords, we have this list of keywords here: evaporation, loose heat, etc., etc. And then our R, which is relationships. We know that more heat equals to more evaporation, more wind equals to more evaporation. And when something is hung above the ground, we know that gravity is acting on it. And just to recap what gravitational forces are, it is a force of attraction between two objects that have mass, right? So then we do our TKR already, and we need to do our final R, which is relevance. And based on what you have learned so far, we need to look at the keywords. So over here we have two keywords: describe and explain. So referring to the table on page 309 and 310, describe refers to writing a detailed description. Explain refers to providing reasons why something happens. So basically, in your answer, you need to describe and explain what happens to the water in the wet towel and not what happens to the towel. So you need to pay attention to what the question requires and not automatically just jump to conclusions. So they are asking you about the water in the wet towel and not the wet towel. So you're not supposed to say that the wet towel will dry, but rather you're supposed to tell us about what happens to the water in the wet towel. All right, so we have done our last R, which is we have identified, describe, and explain as the keywords which is required by the question. So let's take a look at the answer that you will generate. Okay, so remember, you're supposed to talk about water and not the wet towel. the water in the wet towel and not the wet towel. Okay, so firstly, based on our TKR, we know the relationship between water and heat. So the water will evaporate, which is your describe part. And then you have to explain, right? They ask you to describe and explain. So water will evaporate is a detailed description of what happened to the water. Why will the water evaporate? The water will evaporate because of the heat gained from the surrounding air. So that will give you 1 mark. So remember, they are asking for 2 changes. I've given you 1 change, and the other change is that the water will flow downwards from the towel, which is a description of what will happen to the water. Now I need to explain why the water will flow downwards, because of the gravitational force pulling the water. So this will give you 2 marks. Alright, so you need to know that doing science questions, actually there's a list of steps for you to do, and if you do them step by step, and if you start practicing now, when you reach the examinations, it will come to you automatically. Alright, so this answer, if you look at it, it answers both parts of the question. You describe and you explain and you give 2 changes. So this is a very good answer. Alright, let's try another question. Part B of this question asks you to describe 1 change in the weather which would cause the wet towel to dry up faster. So let's do our TKR square. So the topic is about heat. The keywords would be lose heat, gain heat, rate of evaporation, because we know evaporation leads to drying, and then you have your relationships, which I'm sure you can do yourself. But then let's take a look at the relevant section of TKR square. So we need to look at the keywords. So describe. Describe means writing a detailed description. So what affects the rate of drying? So I want you to think about that. What affects the rate of drying? So we know that the rate of evaporation or the rate of drying is affected by wind. The greater amount of wind that you have, or the greater the speed of the wind, actually results in greater evaporation. So we have to describe 1 change in the weather. So what kind of weather would lead to greater drying? They're not just asking you about what would increase evaporation. So you have to mention the word weather in your answer. So the answer would be more windy weather will cause the towel to dry up faster. So there's a typo here, so it's cause rather than because, okay? So more windy weather will cause the towel to dry up faster. So this is a describe question, and it's not an explanation question. If the question requires me to explain why windy weather will lead to faster drying, then I will have to explain the relationship. But this question only requires me to describe. So, and it's also 1 mark, so I don't have to go the extra mile, because just by saying this, I would have answered the question. So you see how by taking a look at the keywords, I am actually narrowing down what I need to write down. Alright? Okay, so let's take a look at part C. So, a runner in a hot country feels cooler if she pours water over her hair to keep it wet, even when the water is at the same temperature as the air around her. So explain why she feels cooler. You might realize that this question seems familiar. Do you remember the relationship of how water on our bodies can actually keep us cool? What kind of processes is related to water, our bodies, and us becoming cooler? Think about that. So first step will be doing your TKR, and then we have to do our final R, which is relevance. So let's take a look at the keywords. So in this question, we have to explain why she feels cooler. So we need to provide reasons why she feels cooler. So based on the first R in the TKR square, which is your relationships, we know that evaporation allows people to feel cooler because it removes heat from the body. So as for example, this is similar to sweating. So when there is moisture on your body, the moisture gains heat from your body and then it removes the heat from your body. So when the body loses heat, what does it feel? It feels cooler. Alright, so remember this is the answer for part C. So remember, based on the keywords, we need to explain, not describe. So we need to provide reasons. So firstly, she feels cooler because the water will gain heat from her body and evaporate. So evaporation removes heat from the body, causing it to lose heat and thus making her body feel cooler. Alright, so this is a very good answer which explains why she feels cooler. So a very bad answer or a wrong answer would be something like what you see below. She feels cooler because her body temperature decreased. Here, you are only describing what her body is going through. You are not explaining why this drop in body temperature happens. So by explaining why this happens, it would include something like the water gaining heat, the body losing heat. So these are the key relationships that you must explain when you are doing explain questions. So explain questions are asking for reason, not asking you for a description of what happens. So take note of that. All right. So now that you have learned how to do the relevance portion of the TKR square, we are not done yet. We have yet to learn about organizing answers. So what this section would go through is how do we write down our answers in a step-by-step fashion that is very clear, such that the examiner or the person marking our work or our friends who are reading our work can understand us. So what are organized answers? So basically, organized answers follow a logical sequence. A leads to B, which then leads to C. So if you look at the example on the right over here, which is an example about cooking, you would see that these pictures follow a logical sequence. Do vegetables magically turn into a plate of rice? No, the answer is definitely no. The vegetables have to be chopped, the vegetables have to be cooked, and then you get a plate of rice. So the same has to follow with your answers. A leads to B, which then leads to C. So vegetables, which is A, is then chopped, which leads to B, and then it is cooked, which leads to C, and then it is served on a plate, which leads to D. It has to follow a logical sequence. So another example for you to think about: before you can go to school, you have to put on your clothes, and then you have to walk down to your door, and then you have to get into the car. You do not just wake up and then suddenly you're in school. Or you do not just wake up, reach school, and then put on your clothes. So a good organized answer follows a logical sequence, and you have to think about what logical sequence is there. A logical sequence in my answer? Alright, so explaining things step by step is your job, not the marker. The marker will not solve the puzzle for you. Just because you have wrote down information that is relevant to the question does not mean that there is a logical sequence. So you need to know that it is your job. The marker is not going to do it for you, because the marker's job is just to check whether you understand. And by giving an answer that is messy, it shows that you do not know the logical sequence of the processes, and therefore it shows that you do not understand the topic. Right? So do not assume that your marker will know what you're talking about. You have to make sure that you explain clearly step by step. So a common saying is that do not assume, because it makes an ass out of you and me. So always remember that it is your job, and that by assuming that the marker will know what you're talking about, you're making an ass out of you and me. Alright, so let's take a look at this. We'll look at the same answer, which is question C, alright? So remember, A leads to B, which then leads to C. A runner in a hot country feels cooler if she pours water over her hair to keep it wet, even when the water is at the same temperature as the air around her. Explain why she feels cooler. So there is a logical sequence to what is happening here. So firstly, she pours water on her hair and then it leads to her feeling cooler. So take a look at the first picture. She pours water on her hair, which is the vegetables. And the final result is she feels cooler, which refers to the plated food. But in the middle, you have two pictures that are not labeled. So you have to make sure that your answer is organized in a way that follows a step-by-step sequence. A leads to B, which then leads to C. Alright, so based on the answer that we have generated in C, firstly, she pours the water on her hair. The water gains heat from her body and evaporates. So evaporation causes the body to lose heat, and hence she feels cooler. So this follows a logical sequence. Imagine if my answer was, the water gains heat from her body, she feels cooler, she pours water on her hair, and then this causes her body to lose heat. That answer will not make sense at all. Although it has all the relevant information, it does not make sense if it's not in a logical sequence. So please do take note of that. Alright, so we have reached the end of the presentation today. So what have you learned today? Firstly, you have learned how to identify what is relevant, which is by looking at the keywords of the question. Secondly, you have learned how to craft an organized answer following a logical sequence. A leads to B, which then leads to C. So you have to consciously, or you have to actively do this when you are doing your questions. Because a common mistake which is done by students is that they can memorize all the facts in the textbook. However, they are unable to arrange the answers in a logical sequence. They are unable to identify which portions of the knowledge is actually relevant. So do take note to practice and practice and practice even more all the things that you have learned in the TKR Square video, as well as this video, alongside the stuff that you are revising. Alright, so before I end this video, you need to know that practice makes perfect. So a quote which is often shared amongst people who are learning something: I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times, which is a quote by Bruce Lee. So you can know 10,000 things, but if you only know it at a surface level, then you don't really know it. But if you know one thing and you have practiced it 10,000 times, then you may actually be very good at it. So the same thing applies to your learning. You can learn 10,000 skills, but if you only use it once, then you don't really know how to use that skill. However, if you use one skill, for example, TKR squared 10,000 times, then you would be an expert in it. And you would actually know and understand how to apply the skills in different situations. And with that, I wish you all the best in your revision, and do practice, practice, and practice.